My name is Nubar of Sapien. I'm from Egypt originally. In Egypt, we say to the family, Al-Baqiyya fi hayatkum, which means, may the rest of her life be realized through yours. I always found that saying in Egypt very comforting, so allow me to share it with you. George, Matthew, former student of mine, Daniel, Nathaniel, Joseph, and Caitlin. I still remember you in diapers being passed from lap to lap during the 1982 war. You had many surrogate mothers in that year. I tried to make sense of the multiple things that Sheila did in her life. And it's very difficult to speak of that in the past tense. So for example, in 1990, she co-wrote a book with a colleague, who was my colleague at Chapman University in Southern California, Don Will, Israel and South Africa, Legal System of Settler Domination. The same person, Sheila, 7 years later, wrote a book, chapter, titled Mental Health Treatment of Children, Families Affected by Substance Abuse and HIV and AIDS. How could the same person have written both? My mind gravitated to the current book I'm working on, which is on how humanism informs his politics, namely the late Edward Said. And I could come up with no other answer than to suggest that it is literally Sheila's humanism, which is her guide to her understanding of politics and the value of the human being, that can enable her to do both with ease, that is, to move across boundaries without recognizing borders, and to excel in both, and looking at the importance of serving justice in Palestine and also advocating for social justice, which means also health justice in the US and particularly in New York City. Now, George and Sheila, you guys must have been nuts to go to Jordan in 1970. Everybody was fleeing, and there they are attending a civil war, for God's sake. So I hope the kids don't do that. I met Sheila probably in 79 or 80 when I relocated from Beirut to the United States and came to New York. She was one of the first 3 people I met. They were the late Iqbal Ahmad, Sheila Ryan, and Stuart Sharp. Right? Those are the first 3 people I met in New York, other than the ones I didn't know. And it was clear to me that anyone who is interested in working on issues of social justice, and particularly justice for Palestinians, Sheila was the address in New York City. I mean, Sheila was foolish enough to have 50 people stand with her, holding signs for in pro-Palestinian in front of 1 million people on Israel Day in New York City. If that doesn't take courage, I don't know what it is. There are a lot more people who today recognize that the Palestine question is central. Even the mayor refused to shut down a debate at Brooklyn College, or a lecture at Brooklyn College. Even the New York Times said, yeah, we're against BDS, but... You know, so in other words, I think, to be optimistic, perhaps, or to use the Gramscian notion of pessimism of the mind, but pessimism of the intellect, but optimism of the will, that those early days of brave individuals who gathered against great odds, they laid the seeds. They literally planted the seeds that today accounts for the Palestine Solidarity Committee that you set up. There are today many Palestine Solidarity Committees across the United States in various campuses, and I think in some ways they all owe something to Sheila, even though they might not know who she was. Now, that function to me was a crucial one. I found that Sheila was able to be probably the least doctrinaire, the most pragmatic organizer who sought unity rather than ideological purity, of which some of you might remember you were parties to seeking the ideological purity in your younger days. I think she did not suffer from that disease. And to me, that was the most endearing quality. But at the same time, she would never fail to ask about the family. The day I was leaving to go to Beirut and Palestine on the 2nd of January was a day that I spoke with Sheila. And the first question, how is Amal? That's my wife. How are the children? Right? And it's kind of one expected that of Sheila, but it was not just niceties. She truly believed it. She lived that. And you could see it in her kids, which we've all come to respect and admire, because we've seen them from youngsters, from diapers, to my student, to now active, productive adults. I'm not going to speak too much, but remember, working in New York on issues relating to Palestinian rights after 1967 was rather odd, right? In the Israeli circle, there was a sense of triumphalism, right? That's almost of biblical proportion. I use that mixed metaphor judiciously. And in the US, much of the left saw the kibbutzim as examples of socialism rather than as colonies, which indeed they were, and they still are. Right? So imagine the courage to work in the setting when all your progressive friends, few in Liberation Youth Service probably were educated, but not much beyond that circle, right? So she and George literally helped educate a generation of activists about the value of looking beyond. Let me look at two instances, and I don't want to take too long, partially because my knee is going to give out on me in a couple of minutes. 1982, we all remember the million-person march on the anti-nuclear movement. The entire peace and justice movement was enamored with the anti-nuclear question. And it is right during that particular major demonstration, of which we were in it, that the conventional war had just started. That is, to not think about conventional wars as having potential trigger mechanisms for nuclear wars would have been foolish, particularly given that the last Arab-Israeli war in 1973, we reached to the top nuclear alert because of that war. So that was the short-sightedness of the peace movement at large. But there were some who were not. The 82 war occasioned, obviously, an invasion, an occupation of a sovereign country, Lebanon. A group of us meeting in Washington founded the Lebanon Emergency Committee. I remember Abdeen, you were there at that meeting. George, you were there. And some of you worked in it. Layli, Paula Hajja, Munir, a few others. But the bulk of the work of the Lebanon Emergency Committee was really anchored in New York. I mean, although I've left New York many years ago and I live in the West Coast, I still tell my students, look, I'm an obnoxious New Yorker, I'm proud to be one. So New York is where it's happening, right? So, and it is right here that a group effort of writing educational materials, having people actually look at the number of people who were detained, name by name. The late Jeanette Waken, I think, Paula, you worked with her on that, under the umbrella of that. And Sheila never claimed credit other than she was there. Right? She didn't say, I'm the head of this thing. Without her, it would have collapsed. And it is in the meetings with Caitlin being passed around from lab to lab that she was able to maintain a coalition. Some people in that coalition were demanding that we specifically agree that Israel's security is important. And I was about to lose my temper, because if anybody was insecure, it was the Lebanese and the Palestinians. The Israelis seemed to have a lot of security at that time, at least militarily speaking. Right? To be able to maintain such a coalition in a city like New York, and without claiming that she was the principal architect in keeping it running, to me was an absolutely incredible task. Now, Sheila also wrote. She wrote in Marib, she wrote in the Journal of Palestine Studies, she wrote a work on Palestine is but not in Jordan, because immediately after the 82 war, this one was published in 83, the discourse was, well, let the Palestinians have Jordan as their state. So she responded by writing around, and if you read her writings on the Middle East, no rhetorical devices used. She does what I tell my students to do, almost very few adjectives. I tell my students to write without adjectives, and then insert only those adjectives without which the meaning would be not clear. So, because adjectives tend to just add puff, right? Unnecessary stuff. You read it, it's sane, anybody can read it. And because the people we worked with were ostensibly church-based people. So she had to communicate with them in a sane voice, with a language understood, without repeating the various ideological formulations that the left was so fond of making. One last event that proved important for Sheila, before she started gravitating towards public health. In the late 80s, we had a major case in Los Angeles that was in the courts for over 20 years, referred to as the LA 8 case. 7 Palestinians and the Kenyan wife of one. They were arrested in early January of 88, although the arrest order was signed on 87, but they did not serve it because the authorities wanted them to have a nice Christmas. So after Christmas, they arrested them. And I remember distinctly, as soon as they came out of prison, a few of us flew from the East Coast to the West Coast, of course, including Sheila. And the point of it was a major campaign. She didn't know any of the 8. That was not the issue. There was a principle involved. And the principle that was involved was they were invoking laws, the McCarran Act, still on the books, seldom used since the McCarthy era, to try to deport some Palestinians. To her, that was outrageous. It was outrageous to me. I was working in Boston at the time. I also flew there. And what she did, because some of you know Sheila could write copy with speed sometimes. And it doesn't need much editing, if any at all, right? So we had her do all that stuff, along with the AFSC office in Pasadena, who were playing an important role in that. And I will never forget that how understated she was in playing that role. And then when she came back, we decided, well, we need to establish a national committee to support the local Committee for Justice, which we did, and of course she served on it. So we would convene in Washington to do that. In other words, what I'm trying to suggest, whether it was a large cause or a small cause, what I think drove her is the fact that when there is injustice, that was her calling. And that's precisely what I had in mind when I suggested that it is her sense of humanism that informed her politics. And we are all the richer for that. To the family, my condolences, and we celebrate her life today. To those of you, let's celebrate together today a rich life And each one of us has our respective stories and how she enriched our lives. I'll let others share those personal stories, but I am profoundly grateful for George and Sheila for being part of me and my family. Thank you.